Thanks very much, Sergio. And thanks also to the organizers, Dirk and Michal, for the invitation to come speak. It's definitely a privilege to be on the program on this historic edition of the Stony Brook Game Theory Conference. So very happy to be here. I want to spend the next 30 minutes or so telling you about some work I've been doing applying mechanism design to blockchains and specifically transaction fee mechanisms. So let me tell you sort of just enough about blockchain so that you can appreciate the mechanism design questions that I want to study. So fundamentally, a blockchain like say Bitcoin or Ethereum, what does it do? Well, it maintains state. So the state including, for example, the current account balances in the native currency of all of the users of the blockchain. And then also a blockchain will execute one by one a sequence of states changing transactions. So an example would be a transfer of funds from one account to another, which of course would change the balances of both those accounts. Now, why is it called a blockchain? Well, it's because, these transactions, and again, a blockchain, really what it's doing is it's just executing a long sequence of transactions one by one. Those transactions aren't added to this sequence one at a time, rather they're added in groups. They're collected together into blocks. And the blocks are then added to the blockchain one by one. What's important for us here is that blocks are only published every so often. So like once every 10 minutes on average in Bitcoin, once every 13 seconds or so in Ethereum. And blocks do not have infinite capacity. So there's a cap on how big they can be. So for example, in Ethereum, size is measured in gas, which is a numerical measure of the computational and storage costs of executing a transaction. And each block has a maximum size of 15 million units of gas, which you should think of as maybe say 500 transactions or something like that. Okay. All right, so because blocks are only published so often and they're only so big, blockchains have a maximum number of transactions per second they can process. And for the really successful blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum, demand is much bigger than the supply. Okay, meaning, for example, on Ethereum, many more than 500 transactions per 13 seconds would be happy to be executed by the Ethereum protocol. And so whenever you have a scarce resource, of course, you'd like to allocate it as efficiently as possible. And so that means we need a mechanism to figure out of all the transactions that would like to be executed, which ones should actually be executed. Ideally the most valuable transactions. So that's exactly the point of a transaction fee mechanism, to choose from all pending transactions which subset actually gets allowed to be executed on the blockchain. So how are transaction fee mechanisms done now? Okay, well, today in Bitcoin, Ethereum, and many other blockchains, what's used is a very natural pay-as-bid mechanism. Okay, so in this context, people call it a first price auction, so I'll call it the same thing. But basically, when you submit a transaction to, say, Bitcoin or Ethereum, you're responsible for also associating a bid in the native currency along with your transaction, okay, how much you'd be willing to pay to have it executed, right? And if your transaction is in fact executed, then that bid will be transferred to the person who carries it out. Right, so who is it who might be executing the transaction? Well, blocks in a permissionless blockchain like Bitcoin or Ethereum, there are these sort of miners, and we don't know who these miners are. The miners could be a dog on the moon, for all you know, okay? But there are people participating that basically compete to add the next block to the blockchain. So you've heard about like proof of work, that's the sort of system which is used today in Bitcoin and Ethereum to choose who gets to publish the next block. And importantly, a miner, a block producer, they can assemble the block however they want. They have dictatorial control. So subject to the block size, they can pack it with whatever transactions they see fit, totally up to them. Okay. All right, so that's how it works right now. Everybody submits a bid, and if your transaction is executed, you pay your bid. And this dates back to Satoshi Nakamoto's 2009 Bitcoin white paper. It's a very natural place to start. But this audience, like if we wanted to throw tomatoes at a first price auction, like we definitely know how to do it, right? And so in particular, one issue is that there's a heavy cognitive burden for figuring out how to bid in first price auctions. Plus, in general, you typically have ex post regret. And so it's natural to then ask, could we do better? Let me make this a little bit more concrete. So, if you're an Ethereum user, say, probably the bids will be attached to your transactions through a piece of software known as a wallet. So I've shown here a screenshot of the most popular Ethereum wallet, MetaMask, and you can see that it actually offers you a price menu. it actually says, hey, if you want your transaction to be executed quickly, meaning in the next, say, 30 seconds, we recommend, bidding $22. If you're happy to wait tens of minutes for your transaction to be executed, then you can probably get away with $17, etc. And any regular user of Ethereum, I should say, so MetaMask, there's very smart people who work there, and so they sort of work hard to come up with a good algorithm for suggesting what to bid, using recent bid data and so on. But any regular user of Ethereum has had the very frustrating experience where basically your wallet just gave you bad advice. For example, it suggested a bid that was too low, and then because it was too low, your transaction just hangs pending for a half an hour or maybe even more, and it's very frustrating. So the difficulty of bidding in first price actions is very much borne out with the experience when you use one of these blockchains. So obviously, as mechanism designers, it's very natural to ask, could we do better? What does better mean? Well, so for example, could it be more incentive compatible, with the holy grail maybe being a dominant strategy incentive compatible mechanism, like the VCG mechanism. Okay. So I'll tell you more about that in a second, but let me pause and say, so I hope you find this sort of problem of transaction fee mechanism design reasonably sort of interesting and fundamental, but at least specifically for Ethereum, it turns out to be a super timely question. Literally just a few weeks from now, so it's scheduled for August 4th. So on August 4th, Ethereum will be throwing out its first price option that it's used since inception and replacing it with a much more sophisticated transaction fee mechanism. Okay? That's something which is known as the EIP 1559 mechanism. EIP here stands for Ethereum Improvement Protocol. Okay? At the moment, it hasn't been deployed, but it seems 99% likely it will be deployed. Again, it's supposed to happen just in a few weeks. It's already happened on test nets. But when I did this work in late 2020, it was not at all clear, actually, that Ethereum was going to make this change. There was, in fact, kind of a raging debate over it. So this is a web search I did back then, maybe 9 months ago. You can see even then there were over 500,000 hits on this seemingly obscure phrase, plus news articles talking about how it was somehow controversial. And in fact, at that time, it was controversial enough. So again, it's late 2020. So Tim Byko, who's a central figure in the Ethereum community, he actually did a community outreach survey. So he contacted various stakeholders in the Ethereum community, like miners, people who write software wallets like MetaMask, people who run exchanges, and he asked everybody, how do you feel about this sort of new transaction fee mechanism proposed in 1559? And if you don't like it, is there anything we could do to make you more comfortable with possibly making this big change to Ethereum's transaction fee mechanism? And a few things were mentioned, but what I wanted to highlight here is, quote, the lack of a formal specification or proof for the mechanism that people can independently evaluate and critique, unquote. That was raised as one of the big issues. And let me emphasize, none of the respondents to this survey were sort of, academic researchers. These were all people in the Ethereum trenches. And there really was sort of a visceral hunger for a formal analysis of this proposed mechanism. And such a formal analysis is one of the goals of the work I'm describing. All right, so the way I want to frame the question is, I want to take the mechanism design settings that we all know and love, and I want to explain what are the idiosyncratic challenges that the blockchain setting poses, and why does that force us to sort of not just, we can't just use off the shelf the VCG mechanism, we really have to sort of think through the problem from scratch. Okay, so this slide will outline the various challenges unique to the blockchain setting. Now, this first challenge, I've labeled it 0 because it's certainly not unique to the blockchain setting. Obviously, users are strategic. They can tell us whatever information they want, might not be truthful. Of course, we all know the language for saying we want to be robust to this problem. We'd like a dominant strategy incentive compatible or DSIC mechanism. All right, so now things that are more unusual in the blockchain setting. Remember I said these blocks that get added to the blockchain. When a miner earns the privilege of publishing a block, it has dictatorial control over its contents. So you can design a transaction fee mechanism with some allocation rule in mind, but the miner can do whatever it wants. It can ignore your intended allocation rule if it's in its own interest. Okay? So that will lead us to state a second kind of incentive guarantee we want, MMIC. I'll state that formally on the next slide, which says that a profit maximizing miner should be motivated to execute the intended allocation rule. Another sort of weird quirk is that whatever your payment rule is, it should be independent of the losing bids. It should depend only on the winning bids, the transactions that are included. Why? Well, it's because the blockchain is really like a hermetic environment. And from the blockchain's perspective, if it's not recorded on the blockchain, it doesn't exist. Okay? Only winning transactions are recorded on the blockchain. Losing transactions are not. So payment should be computable from the on-chain information, namely the winning transactions only. Third challenge is sort of an extension of challenge 1. So a miner has dictatorial control over the block's contents, so it can pick whatever transactions it wants. It can also just sort of fabricate fake transactions if it's in its own best interest. Okay, it can do that in a way that really no one will be able to tell whether it's fake transactions are real or fake. And this is really the stake through the heart of the VCG mechanism, because the VCG mechanism is very easy to manipulate through the injection of fake transactions. Okay, so this will also be rolled in. So being robust to fake transactions will be rolled into the MMIC definition on the next slide. Finally, we want to worry about collusion, and specifically collusion between the miner of a block and the users who created the transactions that might go in the block. We'll worry about them colluding outside of the protocol, off chain. Okay, so that's going to motivate sort of still another. This will be our third incentive constraint, OCA proofness. OCA here stands for off-chain. Okay, so it's a resilience to collusion type property. All right, and then ultimately the question will be, can we have a mechanism which meets all of these challenges? Is DSIC, is MMIC, and is OCA proof? So it's a little more detail on the 2 new incentive constraints. DSIC will be, as all of you are familiar with. So MMIC, what does this say? This just says a miner who wants to maximize the profit it gets from a block maximizes its profit by following the allocation rule you have in mind. Okay? For example, in a first price auction, the allocation rule we have in mind is for the miner to pack the block as full as possible with the transactions with the highest bids. That's exactly what would maximize the miner's profit. So it's like, sure, happy to do that. Happy to follow that allocation rule. As we discussed, the VCG mechanism fails badly, this constraint. In particular, it's very vulnerable to fake injected transactions. All right, so the second new incentive constraint, OCA proofness. So here we're going to insist that a miner and users who created transactions cannot strictly increase their joint utility by colluding off-chain. And I want to make this definition as hard to satisfy as possible, so I'm going to allow relatively powerful cartels, arbitrary side payments. So it's going to be a TU model for the cartel, okay? So if it's ever possible for the miner and the users to kind of do stuff off-chain that results in them overall being strictly better off than if they just participated on-chain, that would be a violation of OCA proofness, okay? First price auctions satisfy OCA proofness. Basically, whatever a miner and users want to do off-chain, whatever side payments they use, they could just instead communicate those through the bids on-chain, no big deal. A non-example, something that fails OCA proofness, is if you try to use a reserve price in the most straightforward way. It turns out a miner and users can actually collude off-chain to circumvent whatever reserve price you're trying to implement. All right, so those are the 3 incentive constraints: DSIC, MMIC, OCA proofness. Now, do we have anything going for us by virtue of it being a blockchain set? Okay, is there any extra footholds we have in our design space? Well, there are, and we're going to make use of these. So first of all, one of these auctions does not occur in a vacuum, right? So in Ethereum, every block, every 13 seconds, an auction is being run. And moreover, the outcomes of all of the past auctions are recorded on chain. So for example, if you want, you could use a different mechanism from block to block, depending on what's happened in the past. For example, you could adjust a reserve price automatically based on what's happened in the past. So that's the first thing. There's lots of kind of just public data that we can use to choose a mechanism. The second thing we have going for us is that we have tremendous control over the flow of the payments. So while a miner can control which transactions it includes in a block and which ones it doesn't, the flow of the payments is completely hard-coded in the protocol. Okay, so baked into the protocol's code right now, it says, whatever the user's bids did gets transferred to the miner of the block. But you could replace that code with doing anything else with those payments, and there's nothing anybody could do about it, okay? So in particular, you could burn people's bids if you wanted, or you could pay them to somebody other than that block's miners, a foundation, miners of other blocks, whatever. Then again, there's nothing anybody can do about this because it's baked into the code. So that's going to be the question. Can we somehow do better than first price auctions by making use of these two advantages of the blockchain setting? And again, better means get as close to DSIC as possible. And it turns out that this new transaction fee mechanism in Ethereum actually gets pretty close to that goal. Okay, just sort of spoiler alert, it's going to be MMIC and OCA proof, just like a first price auction is, but it's also going to be DSIC in some sense most of the time, okay, which I'll make precise as we go along. So let me tell you now how exactly the new transaction fee mechanism deployed on August 4th is going to work, okay? It has three main ideas. Idea one is it's actually going to use a reserve price. Now, maybe you say a reserve price meaning that like if transactions with bids below the reserve price will be ineligible for inclusion in the block. Now, wait a minute, you say. Didn't I just say that if you use a reserve price, you violate OCA proofness, that a miner and users can just sort of evade it by going off chain? I said that was for the most straightforward use of a reserve price, meaning revenue generated by the reserve price getting passed on to the block's miner, the way it is today. So that's what violates OCA proofness. So in EIP 1559, all of the revenues generated by the reserve price, which here is called the base fee, all of the revenue generated by the reserve price will be burned. It will be just taken out of circulation forever. Turns out that gets is going to allow us to have OCA proofness. Okay. So the next question is then, how should this reserve price be set? Okay. Ideally, we want it to be a market clearing price so that, basically the people willing to pay it would be exactly enough to fill up a block, nothing more, nothing less. And so a natural idea is to just use a simple tâtonnement process and look at whether there's excess demand or not to figure out whether to adjust the current reserve price upward or downward. However, there's something complicated, again, because the only thing recorded on chain is winning transactions. How can you differentiate between, on the one hand, the scenario where your reserve price is already perfect, meaning it's a market clearing price, and exactly 15 million gas where the transactions are willing to pay it, versus the scenario where your reserve price is way too low, and you're seeing a full block, but what you're not seeing is that there's 3 times as much other transactions that also were trying to get in at that reserve price because it was way too low. Okay, so that's the issue right now. From purely on-chain data, it's not clear how you can know whether the reserve price is exactly right or if it's too low. So that brings us to key idea number 2, which is allow blocks to have variable size. Again, in the old system, every block has a hard capacity of 15 million gas. In the new transaction fee mechanism, that will be switched from a per block constraint to an amortized constraint. Because the constraint will be that the average block size over long periods of time is at most 15 million gas. Any specific block, however, it will be allowed to go up to 2x the target, okay, up to 30 million gas. Okay, so it'll be able to be the size of 2 regular blocks. How does this help us? Well, this now, block sizes can be our on-chain record of whether or not there's excess demand. Okay, we're shooting for a target of 15. If the last block was sized bigger than 15, we know there's excess demand. We know we need to increase the reserve price. If the last block was less than the target, conversely, we know we need to decrease the reserve price. Okay, so variable size blocks, and we will directly use those blocks as input into our tâtonnement process to pick the current reserve price. There is a specific, frankly, somewhat arbitrary formula for how that reserve price evolves in 1559. It can go up or down by at most 12.5%, then it linearly interpolates between those 2 extremes. Okay, but the details of this will not be important for us today. All right, so those are the first 2 big ideas: a reserve price, crucially revenues from which are burned, and secondly, introducing variable size blocks so you have sort of enough data to carry out a tâtonnement process. But you still might have some questions, right? So for example, all right, but so if you're burning all of the revenue, right, why should, now all of a sudden miners aren't incentivized to do anything? Okay, maybe you say, okay, well, there's still like a block reward, but you still get some sort of fixed reward for mining a block. But okay, as a miner, why would I not just sort of mine an empty block and sort of exclude all of the transactions, which aren't going to pay me anything anyways? The second thing you might wonder is, well, hopefully our reserve price is pretty good. And so the demand at that reserve price is close to our target of 15. But what if it's not? What if our reserve price is excessively low? And actually, we can't even fit everybody willing to pay it in one of these double full blocks. How do we choose which of the people who would like to pay in the double full block how do we choose which ones are actually included? And so those two both, the same. So the third idea. Okay,
10 minutes.
Perfect. The third idea will sort of kill both of those birds with one stone, which is that there's going to be a first price auction basically laid on top of what I've described for you now. It's really meant to be an emergency first price auction, just to be sort of defaulted to in sort of rare cases where your reserve price is completely off. Okay. So the way it works is now as a user, you specify your maximum willingness to pay, and hopefully bidders will just submit the valuation as a maximum willingness to pay. But also there's a second parameter that you submit under this new mechanism known as a tip. And that's the user is basically saying above and beyond the reserve price, I am willing to pay this extra amount to whoever mines my block to incentivize them to actually do it, okay? And again, in the common case, these tips should be like roughly zero. So the common case should be the transactions pay a non-trivial reserve price, all of which is burned, and then a relatively quite small tip, which is then transferred to the miner. That's the vision of how this thing is going to work, okay? And indeed, normally when I get to this part of the design, people feel a little cheated. They're like, I thought the whole point of this was to get away from a first price auction, and now you're telling me there's one there anyways. But again, the hope would be that this would be relevant a very small percentage of the time. Okay, basically, the case where you're going to have to revert to the first price auction is when you're exiting a long period of low stable demand. So you have this very low reserve price, and then there's a demand shock. The demand becomes much higher, and you need to wait. It's going to be ballpark, say, a couple of minutes. You're going to wait a couple of minutes for the reserve price to catch up to where it needs to be, to increase to the market clearing price at the new higher level of demand. So there will be these transitory periods where you default to a first price auction, but the theorem's not going to state is going to say that's the only time you need to default to a first price auction. Okay? So just in these transitory periods, moving from low demand to much higher demand. All right, so let me give you the punchline, and then I'll fill in a little more details, and then I will wrap up with open questions. So just to remind you, status quo, these first price auctions, people submit bids, that bid is transferred to the miner. It's definitely incentive compatible for the miners. They're very happy to pack the block with the highest bidding transactions. It's definitely OCA proof. There's no point to collusion because whatever you collude off chain, you can just record on chain through the first price auction. But naturally, the first price auction utterly fails DSIC, dominant strategy incentive compatibility. There's no interesting conditions under which first price auctions become DSIC. Another thing, now that we've talked through this, that's sort of unsatisfying about first price auctions is they take no advantage of these unique benefits that we have going for us in the blockchain setting. And again, the two benefits are we've got a past and a future. It's not just a single auction in isolation. And moreover, we can do whatever we want with the payments because it's hard coded into the protocol. First price auctions, they do kind of the obvious thing. It's the same every block, ignores the past, et cetera, et cetera. So EIP 1559, let me point out, it definitely takes advantage of both of the sort of benefits of the blockchain setting, right? It uses history, and that's how it chooses its reserve price, and it uses sort of the freedom of what to do with the payments through burning it, okay? And as a consequence, first of all, it retains the MMIC and OCA proof guarantees that first price auctions have. I'm not going to show you the proofs. The proofs aren't that hard, but it is less trivial than for first price auctions. So in particular, it's very important that the base fee revenues are burned. And it's also very important that you have the tipping mechanism in order to have both of these two properties, MMIC and OCA proofs. Okay? It does use details of the mechanism design for sure. And this is what I'll make precise in the next slide, the claim is there are weak conditions under which it acts as a DSIC mechanism. Whereas again, in a first price auction, there's no interesting conditions under which it acts as a DSIC mechanism. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit more about that last point. So exactly when is this?
Yeah. You said besides history and burning, you said the third thing was varying block size.
Yeah.
You are not mentioning it again. Is that a key and important aspect? That's a
great point. So in the theorem I'm going to state on the next slide, there will be two assumptions. And assumption one will be very plausible because we're doing this local search for the market clearing price. So let me actually state this. Okay. So basically assumption one here if you weren't using variable size blocks, if you were just picking random reserve prices, assumption one here could very well be wrong. But because you're being smart about sort of tweaking the reserve price, assumption one here will usually be correct. Will usually hold. So it doesn't, I'm not formalizing usually, right? That would require sort of a bunch of stuff outside my model, like stochastic model of demand, et cetera. But I mean, intuitively, both assumptions should usually be true. All right, so the point of this, we want to formalize under what conditions this 1559 mechanism acts like a DSIC mechanism. Okay, in fact, we'll see it acts like a posted price mechanism under these conditions. Now, why do we need conditions at all? Well, of course we need conditions, right? Because like the reserve price, for all we know, it's zero, right? That would be a weird reserve price. It would have to mean the blockchain had been empty for a long time. But if the reserve price is zero, then it's exactly the same as the first price auction, which of course is not DSIC, okay? So the first assumption we need is that the base fee has to have some semblance to the market clearing price, okay? It cannot be excessively low. What I mean by excessively low is, so precisely, excessively low means demand at that reserve price is not just bigger than the target of 15 million gas, but it's even bigger than 2x the target. It's even bigger than the maximum block size, which is now 30 million gas, okay? So that's a base fee that's way off, way too low, okay? This is what might actually happen in the transitory period when you're going from a period of low demand suddenly to a period of high demand. You will have a sequence, not that long, but you might have, say, I don't know, 10 blocks in a row where the base fee has not really caught up to where it needs to be, okay? But that's the only time you're going to see this. And Pradeep, according to your question, the reason I feel confident saying that's the only time we're going to see this, it's because we're being smart about the tâtonnement process. And again, the variable size blocks we needed as an input to the tâtonnement process because we don't have information about excluded transactions. So we can't just use a direct measure of demand, like how many people sort of didn't win. We have to use an indirect measure of demand, like deviation from the target block size. So that's the role that it plays. So the question then, all right, so it's clear that, if the reserve price is zero for no reason and there's lots of demand, obviously you're not DSIC, but maybe that's the only obstruction to having a truthful mechanism. Well, there's one other kind of minor detail, which is, overbidding, bidding more than your valuation would be a dominated strategy in this mechanism. In principle, people could do it. And if for some reason everybody was crazy and overbid by a lot, it could be the case that even though your reserve price is correct with respect to the underlying demand, with respect to the true valuations, it looks as if it's excessively low with respect to the reported bids, if the bids are much higher than the valuations. So I don't think that's a very interesting case, but I mean, technically I do need this assumption for the theorem to be true, otherwise it would not be true. But under these two assumptions, the base fee is not excessively low. You have room in a double full block for everybody willing to pay the reserve price. And secondly, nobody overbids, then in fact, it's a best response to bid truthfully for every user, no matter what their own valuation, no matter what the valuations of all of the other players. And indeed, it's basically just a posted price mechanism where that posted price is the reserve price. Okay.
2 minutes, Tim.
Great, yeah. So let me just move on to the open questions then, okay? So this is what I mean by usually DSIC. I mean when these two conditions hold. The second condition is a behavioral assumption. I don't really know how to talk about the frequency with which it holds, but it seems like a weak condition. The first one, it'll be really interesting to see once they roll this out 3 weeks from now, we'll actually be able to test the hypothesis that the base fee is excessively low only a very small percentage of the time. That is what I expect, but I'm also extremely curious to see the real world experiment that's going to start in a few weeks. Definitely some open questions that I think are worth working on that would lead to nice papers. First one, all right, so I introduced 3 types of incentive constraints, DSIC, MMIC, and OCA proof. And I proved to you that the 1559 mechanism gets sort of, most of them. Always MMIC, always OCA proof, usually DSIC. In the paper, I give an alternative mechanism, which is always DSIC, always MMIC, usually OCA proof, okay, with similar conditions to what we just saw. Open question, is there a transaction fee mechanism which is guaranteed to meet all 3 incentive guarantees? I don't know the answer. I suspect no, but I would really like to see a proof of that. I only studied incentives on the time scale of a single block. I was just thinking about a miner strategizing for the current block and users strategizing for the current block. Obviously, like blocks are happening over and over again. You could think about incentives over a longer time horizon. I think that would be super interesting. And I really have not done anything on that point. I mentioned in passing this kind of really fairly arbitrary update rule that's sort of governing the tâtonnement process. I think it's a safe bet that that rule will get tweaked over time as people get empirical evidence of how well it works. And that's somewhere I really think theory could be helpful. Okay, theory to sort of give guidance about what properties would you want of what is in some sense an optimal price update rule. And I've been happy to hear that actually there's already some computer scientists working on that very question. So I'm out of time. Thanks again, everyone. Happy to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Tim. There is a question. Oh, okay. There is no, sorry. You answered the question. Yes, Ran Smoloditsky had a question. You just answered it. So, okay. Let's see. Okay, I have to manipulate too many buttons. Any other questions from the participants? I don't see anything else. So I was just wondering if I may use my prerogative of being on the panel. How easy, again, it's theoretical, I know, you'll have better answers next month, but theoretical, how easy it is for the user to identify the bad periods where truth is not necessarily correct, the correct strategy?
Yeah.
You said quickly changing, but quickly is not clear what quickly, I don't know. I mean, is there any theoretical way that one can identify those periods?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just to see if double full blocks are being published, or very close to double full. So remember,
that will be constraint one for the first assumption. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. So if you're getting close to 30, it says that first assumption is getting close to failing.
But the second one is problematic because you have no idea if somebody overbids beyond its value. Its value, that's something private. You have no clue whether this happens.
That's true. Yeah. It's possible. I mean, I think you could probably modify the statement to say that as long as the current price isn't excessively low for the submitted bids. So I define excessively low with respect to the actual demand curve. And you could redefine it so it's with respect to the actual bids submitted, which I feel like is less natural, but you could do that. And then I think the answer to your then your question would be rephrased as how can you tell if the current price is excessively low for the bids that people are currently submitting? And there again, the answer I think would be the same. We look for blocks that are getting close to 30. If they're getting close to 30, you might want to start using a non-trivial tip, assuming your transaction really is time critical. I mean, what's nice is if you can tolerate a 5-minute delay, I don't see any reason to ever bother with the tip, because you would expect within a 5-minute window the sort of the reserve price to adjust correspondingly. Because again, it can go up by a factor of like 10 in a 5-minute period, which I would think should be enough to capture to deal with most of the demand shocks that you're going to see.
But again, that's given the present mechanism. I mean, all your numbers come from the present mechanism, not
Sure.
from the modified mechanism. So, one is to see.
I agree. So that's all speculation. That's the hypothesis. But happily, we'll actually get to test it. So.
And Tim,
okay,
when you
I think
burned, did this mean that that's going to then fall to the operator of the of Ethereum, or what does burned means in terms of the fees being paid? I mean, there's somebody's going to pay something, and then it has to be allocated to somebody. Yes, or
that's right. So when you submit a transaction, you're again going to be, saying how much you're willing to pay,
right?
And basically the protocol will take everything you're paying and take it away from you. It'll redirect the tip part of what you're paying to the miner's account, and then it'll take the part corresponding to the reserve price, and it'll basically send it to the null account. So there's just sort of the all zeros address, which nobody has a key to. So that's kind of the detailed implementation. But it's really kind of like two. So it's one input address, that's the whole fee. Two output addresses, one of which actually corresponds to a real person, whoever's doing the mining. The other one is just kind of a made up, null address.